Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, and Elon Musk. 3 names forever locked at the center of the infamous Penthouse scandal that shocked Hollywood. On one side stands Depp, an untouchable king of cinema. On the other, a humiliated legend whose multi-million-dollar sanctuary was utterly violated. This is not a predictable divorce, but the ultimate stain on the ultra-rich. A boundless party of betrayal where unchecked hedonism completely erased all moral boundaries. How does a cinematic titan find his impenetrable fortress violently transformed into a lawless playground for his wife and a rival billionaire? By the mid-2000s, Depp's level of fame had reached a suffocating, almost radioactive frequency. To survive the relentless, predatory glare of the global paparazzi apparatus, he required more than just a home. He required an impenetrable bunker. He found it atop the Eastern Columbia building in downtown Los Angeles. This striking Art Deco masterpiece, with its iconic turquoise terracotta and giant four-sided clock, loomed over the city like a fortress. Depp did not simply purchase a penthouse. He acquired 5 interconnected units, spending tens of millions of dollars to knock down walls and create a sprawling, highly customized labyrinth. This space was the physical manifestation of his artistic soul and his vast fortune. It was a heavily fortified museum filled with rare literature, vintage guitars, and priceless artwork. The heavy soundproof doors and private elevators were designed with a singular paranoid purpose: to keep the chaotic, consuming noise of the outside world completely locked out. When he married Amber Heard, this sprawling complex was intended to be their ultimate untouchable haven. It was a tangible, extravagant testament to his devotion, an offering of ultimate security to his new bride. Yet the woman who stepped into this meticulously organized ecosystem operated on a completely different, highly volatile wavelength. Amber Heard arrived not merely as a young actress, but as the quintessential modern it girl. She possessed an undeniably magnetic, fiercely untamed aesthetic that easily captivated an aging industry. While Depp sought the quiet, dimly lit isolation of his penthouse to escape his monumental fame, Heard was actively hunting the blinding heat of the spotlight. She brought a chaotic, unapologetic energy into his heavily guarded world, viewing the elite circles of Los Angeles not as a place to hide, but as a sprawling, velvet-roped stage waiting to be conquered. The public and the media initially consumed their union with a mixture of intense fascination and quiet skepticism. They painted a portrait of a bohemian fairy tale, the established, brooding legend successfully claiming the fiercely independent young starlet. It felt like a triumph over time, a romantic renaissance for a veteran actor. The world saw the confident smiles, the dazzling red carpet appearances, and the undeniable physical chemistry. They were entirely blind to the immense, terrifying instability brewing behind the locked doors of the Eastern Columbia penthouses. The foundation of the fortress was not breached by an external attack. The invisible hairline fractures were already forming from the inside, created by a fundamental, irreconcilable clash of desires. The impenetrable sanctuary was quietly being primed for a hostile takeover, waiting only for the arrival of an entirely new echelon of power to blow the doors wide open. The tectonic plates of the entertainment ecosystem were experiencing a violent shift. Traditional Hollywood power structures, built over decades on box office returns, were being aggressively encroached upon by a new, infinitely wealthier breed, the titans of Silicon Valley. These tech billionaires viewed Los Angeles not with the reverence of artists, but as a highly marketable recreational playground. At the absolute forefront of this cultural invasion stood Elon Musk, accumulating wealth at a velocity that defied standard economic logic. Musk operated with the uninhibited confidence of a man whose staggering net worth rendered him immune to ordinary societal consequences. For a woman operating on Amber Heard's ambitious frequency, a Silicon Valley billionaire represented the ultimate apex of unfiltered power. The intersection of her status-driven trajectory and his untouchable hubris hubris created a highly combustible dynamic circling the perimeter of the Eastern Columbia building, entirely unconcerned with the formidable reputation of the cinematic king residing inside. For the Eastern Columbia penthouses to transition into an arena of unchecked elite indulgence, the king had to be removed from the board. That removal was mandated by the ruthless machinery of the Hollywood studio system. In early 2015, Johnny Depp was summoned to the Gold Coast of Australia to begin production on the 5th installment of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. This was not merely a change of location for a standard film shoot. It was a massive, highly coordinated corporate extraction that would geographically and temporally sever the veteran actor from the meticulous reality he had built in Los Angeles. This departure created an unprecedented vulnerability. By the 5th film, the character of Captain Jack Sparrow had ceased to be a mere cinematic role. It had mutated into a multi-billion-dollar global commodity. Entire studio quarterly earnings, the livelihoods of thousands of crew members, and massive international marketing campaigns rested squarely upon Depp's aging shoulders. The physical toll of inhabiting the character was grueling. He was required to strap on the intricate leather costuming, the boots, and the dense layers of theatrical makeup under the punishing, sweltering heat of the Australian sun. The production schedule was relentless, a highly industrialized grind that demanded 12 to 14-hour days of intense physical stunts, complex wire work, and endless rehearsals. He was not just an actor on a set, he was the primary engine of a staggering corporate behemoth, expected to perform with flawless, eccentric energy regardless of the profound exhaustion settling deep into his bones. The geographical reality of the Australian production served as a powerful, isolating wedge. The Gold Coast is situated roughly 7,500 miles away from the sprawling, neon-lit grid of Los Angeles. More critically, the two locations are separated by a brutal, disorienting 17-hour time difference. When the sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean in California, signaling the beginning of the elite Hollywood nightlife, the relentless alarms were already sounding on the Australian film set, dragging the actor into the grinding machinery of another dawn. This temporal disconnect fundamentally shattered the standard rhythms of domestic communication. The marriage was suddenly forced to exist in a fragmented, asynchronous vacuum. The spontaneous, grounding moments of shared domesticity were entirely erased, replaced by scheduled, brief, and increasingly strained phone calls severely hampered by exhaustion and terrible cellular connections. Depp was plunged into a state of extreme psychological quarantine. He was surrounded by hundreds of crew members, fixers, and studio executives, yet he existed in a profound, echoing state of isolation, entirely cut off from the emotional and physical anchors of his Los Angeles sanctuary. As the veteran actor was absorbed into the grueling, isolated reality of the Australian production, a terrifying, silent vacuum opened up within the soundproofed walls of the Eastern Columbia building. The sprawling collection of interconnected penthouses, previously vibrating with the heavy, brooding energy of their owner, suddenly grew intensely, unnervingly quiet. The vintage guitars sat untouched in their velvet-lined cases. The massive, meticulously curated library of rare literature lay undisturbed. The impressive collection of artwork stared out at empty hallways. The fortress had been explicitly designed and heavily financed to lock the chaotic noise of the world out, but with the patriarch removed from the ecosystem, those same heavy doors and private elevators now served to lock the silence in. For a woman operating on the hyper-accelerated, intensely social frequency of Amber Heard, the sprawling, silent penthouses quickly ceased to feel like a protective artistic haven. Without the grounding presence of her veteran husband, the sheer scale of the Los Angeles residence felt overwhelmingly empty, presenting an entirely different kind of opportunity. The transition from a quiet marital home into a highly active, exclusive hub for elite indulgence did not happen with a sudden, explosive announcement. It was a gradual, insidious insidious erosion of boundaries, facilitated entirely by the bulletproof security infrastructure Depp himself had purchased. The private elevators, which required highly restricted keycard access, ensured that whoever was invited into the penthouses could arrive and depart with absolute, guaranteed invisibility. There were no hotel lobbies to navigate, no public valet stands where photographers could lurk, and no neighbors who could casually observe the shifting demographic of the guest list. The Eastern Columbia building offered the ultimate, most coveted luxury in the modern entertainment ecosystem: complete, unmonitored secrecy. Operating within this impenetrable bubble, the young actress was granted an unprecedented level of autonomy. The 17-hour time difference acted as a flawless built-in alibi. She possessed the absolute certainty that while the Los Angeles night was just beginning, her husband was hopelessly tethered to a massive soundstage on the other side of the planet, entirely consumed by the crushing demands of a billion-dollar production. The geographical and temporal distance effectively suspended the standard rules of marital accountability. The psychological tether to the marriage frayed under the intoxicating realization that there were absolutely no immediate consequences for her actions. The penthouses were no longer functioning as a sacred, shared domestic space. They were rapidly mutating into a private, highly secure kingdom where she alone dictated the rules of engagement. The heavy, isolating atmosphere of the empty Los Angeles fortress became a breeding ground for crossed lines and dangerous invitations. The initial quiet evenings likely gave way to increasingly elaborate, uninhibited gatherings. The intoxicating allure of the space was undeniable. To the young, elite members of the Hollywood and fashion circuits, access to the famously reclusive Johnny Depp's private sanctuary was a rare, highly coveted currency. The wine cellars were heavily stocked, the living spaces were sprawling and luxurious, and the panoramic views of the downtown Los Angeles skyline provided a breathtaking, cinematic backdrop for consequence-free hedonism. The penthouses transformed into a velvet-roped VIP room, a highly exclusive arena where the relentless pressure of public scrutiny simply vanished the moment the private elevator doors slid shut. It was within this newly repurposed, highly unstable environment that the traditional boundaries of the marriage were completely pulverized. The fortress that had been built to protect their union was weaponized to dismantle it. Johnny Depp had utilized his immense, hard-won fortune to construct the ultimate defense mechanism against an industry that constantly threatened to consume his private life. He had built walls thick enough to keep the entire world at bay. Yet, in his desperate attempt to secure a haven, he had inadvertently constructed the perfect, unassailable stage for his own betrayal. He had financed the lighting, provided the set design, and guaranteed the security for a production that he would never be allowed to direct, while the veteran actor remained tethered to the grueling demands of the global studio apparatus. The boundaries of his Los Angeles sanctuary were actively being rewritten. The deep, rumbling machinery of the Silicon Valley elite was already beginning to circle the perimeter of the Eastern Columbia building, entirely aware that the king was in exile and the gates of the fortress had been quietly, invitingly left ajar. The stage was flawlessly set, the security cameras were rolling, the quiet, devastating collision of Hollywood royalty and tech billionaire hubris was no longer a theoretical threat. It was actively stepping into the private elevator, entirely confident that the owner of the house was too far away to ever hear the doors slide open. The physical transformation of a sacred space does not necessarily require the swinging of sledgehammers or the tearing down of drywall. The most profound desecrations are often entirely atmospheric, executed through a slow, deliberate shift in frequency. paparazzi. When Johnny Depp's private jet cleared the California airspace, bound for the grueling production sets of Australia, the sprawling Eastern Columbia penthouses were still vibrating with the heavy, gothic, and intensely literary energy of their creator. The rooms were shadowed, smelling of aged paper, expensive tobacco, and vintage wood. It was a space designed for brooding introspection. Yet, within a remarkably short window of time, that carefully cultivated, moody aesthetic was violently aggressively overwritten. Amber Heard did not merely occupy her husband's empty residence. She executed a comprehensive, psychological, hostile takeover, converting a multi-million-dollar artistic fortress into the most exclusive, heavily fortified nightclub in downtown Los Angeles. Without the anchoring presence of the veteran actor, the heavy oak doors of the penthouses were thrown open to an entirely different demographic. The aging rock stars, the eccentric filmmakers, and the reclusive literary figures who typically populated Depp's inner circle were swiftly excised. In their place, a new hyper-accelerated breed of Hollywood elite began to flood the private elevators. These were not artists seeking a quiet refuge from the flashbulbs. These were the apex predators of the Los Angeles nightlife ecosystem. They were young, phenomenally wealthy, and driven by a nihilistic appetite for consequence-free consumption. The penthouses ceased to function as a marital home. They were abruptly repurposed into a sprawling, velvet-roped VIP lounge, entirely insulated from the rules, the paparazzi, and the police. The sensory details of this transformation paint a devastating picture of absolute disrespect. The heavy velvet curtains that Depp had installed to block out the searing California sun were now drawn to conceal gatherings that stretched relentlessly from the dark hours of midnight well into the blinding glare of the following afternoon. The vintage record players previously used to spin obscure blues and classic rock were drowned out by the thumping, relentless bass of modern electronic club tracks. The pristine, antique Persian rugs, purchased with the spoils of a 30-year cinematic legacy, were subjected to the careless spill of expensive champagne and top-shelf liquor. The scent of old books was entirely eradicated, replaced by the sharp, metallic odor of synthetic narcotics, the heavy cloud of expensive designer perfumes, and the stale sweat of continuous, uninhibited physical exertion. It was a brutal, systematic erasure of the man who held the deed to the property. At the absolute center of this swirling, chemical-fueled vortex stood Amber Heard, operating with the terrifying confidence of a newly crowned monarch who had just successfully locked the king out of his own castle. She shed the restrictive, heavily scrutinized mantle of the supportive Hollywood wife and reverted instantly to her baseline frequency, a chaotic, fiercely untamed provocateur. The penthouses became her ultimate weapon of social currency. In the ruthless, highly transactional economy of the entertainment elite, possessing the keys to an impenetrable, unmonitored fortress elevates one's status to the absolute pinnacle of the hierarchy. She was no longer just a beautiful actress. She was the gatekeeper to the ultimate playground. She dictated who was granted access to the sprawling rooftop terraces, who was allowed to pour from the veteran actor's meticulously curated wine cellar, and, most importantly, who was permitted to cross the threshold into the most intimate, sacred spaces of the residence. The gravity of these gatherings fundamentally shifted with the arrival of specific high-profile catalysts. The Los Angeles party circuit is inherently localized, but to truly elevate a gathering into the realm of legendary global decadence, it requires an injection of foreign, unchecked energy. That injection arrived in the form of Cara Delevingne. The British supermodel was not merely a recognizable face. She was a cultural phenomenon, the reigning queen of the notorious notorious London underground party scene. She possessed a sprawling aristocratic background, astronomical wealth, and a highly publicized reputation for pushing the boundaries of hedonism to their absolute breaking limits. De Lavigne did not attend parties to quietly sip cocktails in the corner. She arrived to orchestrate absolute, uninhibited chaos. When De Lavigne's chaotic, London-bred frequency collided with Heard's aggressive, Los Angeles-based ambition within the sealed vacuum of the Eastern Columbia building, the resulting chemistry was highly combustible. They were two of the most photographed, fiercely desired women on the planet, operating behind locked doors with the absolute certainty that their actions would never be subjected to the moral judgment of the public. The presence of the British supermodel acted as a massive accelerant. She brought with her an entourage of fiercely wealthy, deeply detached individuals who viewed the traditional boundaries of marriage, property, and respect as archaic, irrelevant concepts. The penthouses were no longer just hosting loud dinners, they were hosting sprawling, multi-day benders characterized by a terrifying lack of restraint. The guests navigating the sprawling hallways of the penthouses were entirely aware of whose floor they were walking on. They were drinking Johnny Depp's highly allocated wine. They were utilizing his custom-built furniture as casual resting places for their drinks and their bodies. They were operating in the exact spaces where a cinematic legend had sought quiet refuge, and they were doing it with a mocking, arrogant impunity. The sheer hubris required to look around a multi-million-dollar sanctuary funded by a man currently sweating through 14-hour days on an Australian soundstage and treat it like a disposable rented hotel room is staggering to contemplate, as the alcohol acted as a corrosive solvent and synthetic substances short-circuited the standard neurological pathways of guilt and hesitation. The physical boundaries of the penthouses began to completely dissolve. A standard Hollywood party typically remains confined to the public spaces, the living rooms, the kitchens, the rooftop decks. However, the gatherings orchestrated by Heard rapidly breached the final, most intimate perimeters of the marital home. The master bedroom, the ultimate symbol of domestic exclusivity and spousal trust, was aggressively stripped of its sanctity. It was casually repurposed into just another room for the elite to sprawl out, to hide from the noise, and to engage in deeply compromising, boundary-less interactions. The heavy mahogany doors of the bedroom were no longer closed to protect a marriage. They were closed to protect the illicit activities of the guests. The sheer logistics required to maintain this level of continuous high-volume hedonism implicate a wide network of silent, heavily compromised enablers. The Eastern Columbia penthouses were not isolated cabins in the woods. They were located in a highly staffed premium residential building. Private security guards, building concierges, and personal housekeepers were forced to operate as unwilling, silent witnesses to the desecration. These individuals, whose salaries were ultimately funded by the veteran actor laboring in Australia, were commanded by the young wife to facilitate the chaos. They were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, look the other way when high-profile guests stumbled out of the private elevators at dawn, and meticulously clean the staggering physical wreckage left behind by the nightly benders. The payroll had been entirely corrupted. The security apparatus built to protect Johnny Depp was now being actively utilized to protect the people who were humiliating him. This environment of unchecked chemical-fueled indulgence perfectly primed the psychological landscape for the ultimate, most devastating acts of betrayal. When a space is systematically stripped of its respect, when the rules of basic human decency are repeatedly mocked and discarded by a cheering crowd of supermodels and trust fund heirs, the concept of marital fidelity becomes nothing more than a laughable abstract theory. Amber Heard had successfully engineered a sterile, consequence-free vacuum. She had surrounded herself with a choir of elite enablers who applauded her rebellion and actively encouraged her detachment from the reality of her vows. She had transformed the fortress into a lawless sovereign state, completely detached from the legal and emotional jurisdiction of the man who owned it. The parties hosted in the Eastern Columbia building were not accidental lapses in judgment. They were deliberate, highly visible performances of power. It was an infinitely cruel transgression to invite the apex of global wealth and beauty directly into the marital bed. They were a statement that the young, fiercely beautiful it girl and her elite, uninhibited friends had successfully conquered the territory of the aging king. As the bass reverberated through the custom-built walls and the heavy scent of indulgence saturated the expensive upholstery, the penthouses drifted further and further away from any recognizable concept of a home. The sanctuary had been fundamentally poisoned. The stage was now perfectly, flawlessly set. The boundaries of the marriage had not just been pushed, they had been aggressively pulverized into dust by a relentless parade of extreme wealth and youthful arrogance. The environment was fully optimized, waiting only for the arrival of the ultimate, most powerful predator in the new Los Angeles ecosystem to step into the private elevator, entirely confident that the fortress had already been successfully, totally surrendered from the inside. The most devastating betrayals are rarely documented by the frantic, flashing bulbs of the professional paparazzi or the breathless, highly embellished accounts of anonymous tabloid informants. They are captured by a far more clinical, entirely unforgiving witness. The security apparatus of the Eastern Columbia building was a multi-million-dollar digital fortress meticulously engineered by Johnny Depp to protect his privacy, filter his guests, and maintain an absolute ironclad perimeter against the consuming noise of Los Angeles. There were dozens of high-resolution lenses bolted to the ceilings, silently monitoring the subterranean parking garages, the sprawling lobbies, and the highly restricted private elevators. These cameras were fundamentally designed to look outward, to scan the horizon for external threats. The tragic, staggering irony of this technological architecture is that it ultimately functioned as a silent digital panopticon, recording the absolute destruction of the veteran actor's life from the inside out. The fortress did not fail to capture the enemy. It simply documented the terrifying reality that the enemy had already been granted the master keys. When the heavy, polished steel doors of the private elevator slid open to admit the newest arrival to the Penthouse ecosystem, the lens positioned in the upper corner of the cabin began to quietly record a sequence of frames that would permanently alter the historical record of Hollywood. The individual stepping into the confined, brilliantly lit space was not a stray partygoer or a recognizable actor navigating the Los Angeles nightlife. It was Elon Musk. He did not arrive with the anxious, hurried energy of a man participating in a clandestine affair. He moved with the seamless, terrifying glide of an apex predator who had already assessed the territory and recognized the absolute absence of a rival. The tech billionaire possessed a level of wealth and global influence that effectively neutralized the standard paranoia governing celebrity interactions. He was operating completely outside the traditional jurisdiction of the entertainment industry, utilizing the quiet, unmonitored pathways of the elite to bypass the paparazzi and step directly into the central nervous system of a cinematic legend's private life. However, the true visceral horror of the surveillance footage is not rooted merely in the presence of the billionaire. The most chilling empirical evidence of the desecration is derived entirely from the visual presentation of the woman standing beside him. As the elevator doors sealed them inside the steel box, initiating the slow mechanical ascent toward the penthouses, Amber Heard was captured in a state of attire that fundamentally obliterated any remaining illusion of a platonic social gathering. She was not wearing an elegant evening gown from a high-profile Hollywood gala. She was not dressed in the casual bohemian aesthetic she frequently utilized for daytime paparazzi walks. hours. She was captured standing in the brilliant overhead lighting of a residential transit space wrapped entirely, exclusively in a simple white towel. The breathtaking arrogance of this specific visual systematically dismantles the deeply ingrained social and psychological boundaries governing human attire. A damp white terry cloth towel is the universal uniform of the bathroom. It represents the absolute most vulnerable state of post-shower intimacy. It is an extremely fragile, temporary garment utilized exclusively in the few short steps between stepping out of the water and accessing a private wardrobe. To wear this item, and only this item, outside the immediate, locked confines of a personal washroom requires a staggering, almost incomprehensible level of comfort with the surrounding environment and the individuals occupying it. By navigating the corridors and the elevator of the Eastern Columbia building in this specific state, Heard was loudly visually broadcasting that the standard protective formalities of human interaction had been completely abandoned. The security footage captures her with damp, unstyled hair cascading over her bare shoulders, her posture devoid of any defensive rigidity. This was not a woman who'd been caught off guard or forced into a compromising scenario. This was a woman who had willingly, confidently stripped away the heavy public armor of her Hollywood persona to exist in a state of raw domestic vulnerability in the direct presence of a rival billionaire. The towel was not an accident. It was a loud, undeniable uniform of consequence-free entitlement. It signaled that the sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouses above them were no longer functioning as a respected marital home. They had been aggressively repurposed into a personal, highly secure locker room where the young actress felt entirely comfortable shedding her clothing, her inhibitions, and her legally binding vows before stepping onto the elevator. The body language documented by the unblinking digital eye amplifies the cruelty of the transgression to a deafening volume. In the claustrophobic metallic confines of the elevator cabin, distance is the standard metric of respect. Individuals who are merely acquaintances or those harboring the natural guilt of a hidden affair instinctively maintain a rigid physical perimeter, acutely aware of the surveillance cameras tracking their movements. Yet the footage reveals a dynamic that violently rejects any concept of caution or remorse. Heard is seen actively leaning her damp frame into the tech mogul, resting her head against him in a posture of profound, unguarded affection. She nestles into the space between his shoulder and his chest, entirely comfortable, initiating a level of physical proximity that is traditionally reserved strictly for the heavy closed doors of a master bedroom. Elon Musk, in turn, absorbs this intimacy with a terrifying, relaxed ease. He does not flinch away from the security camera. He does not attempt to create a respectful distance to preserve the dignity of the absent husband. His posture communicates the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who feels entirely entitled to the space he is occupying, and the woman leaning against him. The physical connection captured in those grainy, digital frames is not characterized by the frantic, panicked energy of a stolen moment. It is characterized by a slow, casual, and deeply arrogant familiarity. They are standing in an elevator purchased by Johnny Depp, utilizing the electricity paid for by Johnny Depp, ascending to a fortress designed by Johnny Depp, and they are doing it while engaging in a casual, tactile display of affection that completely eradicates the veteran actor's existence. The true psychological violence of this recorded moment is heavily dependent on the sheer absence of fear. If an individual is actively committing an act of profound betrayal against one of the most powerful, fiercely protected cinematic icons on the planet, the baseline human response should be an overwhelming, suffocating terror. There should be a frantic, nervous scanning of the environment, a desperate attempt to conceal the phase, or at the very least, a tense, rigid posture born from the acute awareness of the massive risks involved. The devastating reality exposed by the elevator tape is that neither the young actress nor the billionaire possessed even a microscopic fraction of that fear. They simply did not care. They operated under the toxic, highly insulated delusion that their combined youth, beauty, and astronomical wealth effectively rendered them completely invisible and entirely untouchable. They were playing a devastating high-stakes game in the lion's den, completely unbothered by the fact that the lion was still technically alive. The mechanical ascent of the elevator cabin serves as a powerful, agonizing metaphor for the climax of the betrayal. As the digital numbers above the doors climbed higher, ticking off the floors of the historic Art Deco building, the physical distance between the illicit couple and the sacred space of the penthouses rapidly vanished. They were being steadily transported upward, moving away from the grounding reality of the Los Angeles streets and ascending directly into the rarefied velvet-roped vacuum of the elite playground Amber Heard had meticulously constructed. The elevator was not merely a mode of transportation, it was a highly secure private portal lifting them into a sovereign state where the rules of traditional morality, loyalty, and marital respect simply ceased to apply. When the doors finally slid open at the top of the building, they were no longer just a billionaire and a young actress. They were the conquering monarchs stepping out into a newly acquired territory, ready to consume the spoils of a quiet, bloodless coup. The initial geographical isolation of the 2015 Australian shoot had created the early fractures, but the absolute collapse of the sanctuary occurred later. Security footage and subsequent court depositions aligned these extreme breaches with the volatile disintegration of their marriage in late 2016. While Depp's cinematic empire funded the multi-million-dollar ecosystem of the penthouses, the fortress itself had been entirely co-opted. He was the undisputed financial and architectural engine of the space, yet he had been functionally reduced to an unwitting landlord funding a lawless playground. The individual standing in the quiet hum of that steel box entirely believed that the heavy doors would slide shut and the moment would instantly, permanently evaporate into the dark vacuum of the Los Angeles night. They trusted the impenetrable insulation of extreme wealth, assuming their actions were shielded by an invisible, heavily financed force field. They failed to recognize the cold, objective permanence of the digital ghosts they were actively creating. The security camera did not possess a non-disclosure agreement. It could not be bribed with a massive settlement or silenced by a team of high-powered Hollywood public relations executives. It simply recorded the photons bouncing off the white terry cloth towel, capturing the exact relaxed angle of the billionaire's posture and the undeniable, quiet arrogance of the young actress's smile. The digital files were silently written to a hard drive buried deep within the security infrastructure of the building, sitting perfectly dormant in the dark. It was a highly explosive, radioactive piece of visual evidence waiting with the terrifying clinical patience of a sniper. The subjects exited the elevator and disappeared into the sprawling, unmonitored expanse of the penthouses, completely unaware that they had just authored the exact, undeniable visual documentation of their own future destruction. The footage lay quietly in the archives, a ticking time bomb intricately wired to the foundation of the fortress, waiting only for the inevitable collapse of the marriage to finally detonate, threatening to drag the darkest, most depraved secrets of the Hollywood elite out of the shadows and violently into the blinding, unforgiving light of the global public square. The final threshold of any sanctuary is not the heavy front door, nor is it the private elevator that guards the perimeter. The ultimate, most sacred perimeter of a marital fortress is the threshold of the master bedroom. In the architectural hierarchy of a home, this space is specifically designated as the absolute center of trust. It is the singular room where the heavy, exhausting armor of public life is finally unbuckled and discarded. For a man like Johnny Depp, whose entire existence was subjected to the microscopic, relentless dissection of the global media, the master bedroom of the Eastern Columbia penthouse was the only remaining territory on Earth where he was completely safe from consumption. It was a space consecrated by his vows, furnished with his immense fortune, and strictly off limits to the sprawling, chaotic machinery of the Hollywood ecosystem. To breach this specific room is to execute the absolute most intimate form of psychological violence against the owner. When Amber Heard, Elon Musk, and Cara Delevingne allegedly crossed this final threshold, the narrative of the Los Angeles penthouse abruptly transitioned from a story of wild, unauthorized partying into a chilling chronicle of territorial conquest. The sprawling, neon-lit skyline of downtown Los Angeles, glowing through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, provided a cinematic backdrop for an act of staggering disrespect. The heavy, customized doors of the master suite were pulled shut, entirely sealing off the three figures from the lingering noise of the VIP gatherings occurring in the living spaces below. The empirical details of what allegedly transpired within that room were not immediately broadcast to the world. They were protected for years by the impenetrable silence of the elite, locked away in a dark vault of non-disclosure agreements and the terrified compliance of the household staff. The truth did not emerge through a leaked tabloid photograph or a careless social media post. It was forcibly dragged into the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light of a legal deposition years after the fact. The mechanism of this exposure is crucial to understanding the gravity of the event. The secrets of the ultra-rich are rarely surrendered voluntarily. They must be surgically extracted under the rigid, terrifying threat of perjury. The devastating revelation arrived via the sworn, videotaped testimony of Joshua Drew, a man who had lived intimately within the penthouse ecosystem. He was the former husband of Amber Heard's closest confidant, Raquel Pennington, and had occupied one of the adjacent penthouses financed by Depp during the marriage. Seated in a sterile conference room, entirely stripped of the glamorous Hollywood lighting, Drew was subjected to the clinical, unyielding questioning of aggressive legal counsel. When asked directly, under oath, if Amber Heard had engaged in a three-way intimate affair with Elon Musk and Cara Delevingne within the confines of Johnny Depp's Los Angeles residence while the actor was away, Drew's response was a quiet, devastating confirmation. He testified that his ex-wife had explicitly informed him of the encounter, detailing the specific date and the specific participants who had occupied the veteran actor's marital bed, actively choosing to execute this level of uninhibited hedonism inside the primary marital bed of a global cinematic icon, a man currently bleeding for his craft on a foreign continent specifically to fund the very sheets they were laying on, was a display of arrogance bordering on the sociopathic. Amber Heard, the orchestrator of the environment, was utilizing the physical space of her marriage as a highly provocative stage by inviting the absolute apex of global wealth and fashion into her husband's bed. She was executing a flawless, invisible coup. She was demonstrating her absolute control over the veteran actor's territory, proving to herself and her elite peers that she was not bound by the archaic, restrictive rules of her vows. The bed was no longer a place of marital connection. She had aggressively repurposed it into an altar of consequence-free indulgence, sacrificing her husband's dignity to secure her position at the absolute center of the new Hollywood power dynamic. Cara Delevingne's alleged presence in the room introduces a deeply chaotic, aristocratic element to the desecration. As a reigning supermodel and a product of intense British wealth, Delevingne operated in a stratosphere where the traditional consequences of human behavior simply do not register. Her participation in the encounter signifies the terrifying detachment of the global party elite. To the ultra-wealthy individuals navigating the international social circuit, a multi-million-dollar penthouse is merely a temporary, disposable venue. The fact that the bed belonged to Johnny Depp did not serve as a moral deterrent. It likely served as a highly intoxicating accelerant. The sheer taboo of defiling the sanctuary of a legendary figure adds a potent, deeply dark thrill to the experience. It transforms a standard physical encounter into an act of elite vandalism, a way for the untouchable class to quietly mock the established order of the entertainment industry. Yet the most deeply destructive, deeply emasculating element of the alleged encounter is undeniably the presence of Elon Musk. The tech billionaire did not accidentally wander into the master bedroom. He was a conquering force occupying a highly specific, highly coveted territory. In the primal, deeply ingrained psychology of human dominance, there is no victory more absolute, no insult more permanent than laying claim to a rival's most intimate space. Musk, a man who built his entire empire on the aggressive disruption of established industries, was now actively disrupting the domestic foundation of a cinematic king. He was stamping his invisible billionaire footprint directly onto the mattress of a man who had spent 30 years building an untouchable legacy. The billionaire's participation in the three-way encounter is the ultimate demonstration of structural impunity. When an individual possesses a net worth that eclipses the gross domestic product of small nations, the standard emotional frequencies of guilt, hesitation, or respect for another man's household simply evaporate. Musk operated with the terrifying, unblinking certainty that he could consume the young actress, utilize the supermodel, and desecrate the veteran actor's bed without ever facing a single tangible repercussion. He was a tourist taking a violent hedonistic vacation in Johnny Depp's life, entirely confident that his massive corporate shield would protect him from any subsequent fallout. He could engage in the ultimate act of disrespect, secure in the knowledge that his rocket launches and electric car empires would completely overshadow any potential tabloid scandal. The sheer cruelty of this territorial conquest is magnified exponentially by the glaring asymmetry of the power dynamic. Johnny Depp had amassed a vast fortune, but his power was fundamentally rooted in his public image, his artistic vulnerability, and his emotional connection with a global audience. Elon Musk's power was rooted in raw, unyielding mathematics and technological monopolies. By penetrating the Eastern Columbia penthouse, the tech mogul was brutally proving that the emotional and artistic legacy of Hollywood is entirely defenseless against the cold, clinical force of Silicon Valley capital. He was reducing Johnny Depp, a man worshipped by millions, into a temporary, unwitting landlord who was merely keeping the bed warm for the new ruling class. Years later, when the brutal transcripts of Joshua Drew's deposition finally leaked into the public domain, igniting a massive, unprecedented firestorm of media scrutiny, Elon Musk immediately mobilized his formidable public relations machinery. He issued swift, clinical denials to the global press, vehemently insisting that his relationship with Cara Delevingne was strictly platonic and flatly rejecting the accusation of the three-way encounter. He maintained the rigid narrative that his romantic involvement with Amber Heard only commenced after she had officially, legally separated from her husband. However, in the ruthless, highly visceral court of public opinion, the technicalities of timelines and PR statements rarely survive the explosive impact of a sworn witness testimony. The physical existence of the elevator surveillance footage, capturing the undeniable intimate proximity of Heard and Musk in a towel, had already established a profound baseline of deception. The public had already seen the visual proof that the boundaries of the fortress had been breached. Therefore, the sworn allegations of the threesome, regardless of the billionaire's frantic denials, landed with the devastating, irrevocable force of a cultural bomb. The imagery was simply too potent, too perfectly aligned with the darkest suspicion society harbors about the depravity of the ultra-rich to be easily dismissed. The true casualty of these sworn allegations was not the reputation of the billionaire or the supermodel. They were heavily armored and inherently designed to survive controversy. The true absolute casualty was the psychological foundation of the veteran actor. For a man's deepest, most humiliating betrayal to be meticulously detailed in a legal deposition, transcribed into court records, and subsequently broadcast to every smartphone on the planet is a form of torture that defies standard comprehension. The world was not just reading about an affair, they were actively, morbidly visualizing his young wife and a rival billionaire treating his most sacred domestic space like an elite playground. The psychological mutilation inflicted upon Johnny Depp by this specific revelation is profound and permanent. It strikes at the absolute agonizing core of human pride and male vulnerability. To learn that the woman you loved, the woman you showered with tens of millions of dollars in real estate and unparalleled security, utilized your absence to orchestrate a multi-person encounter in the very bed you shared, is an injury that cannot be repaired by wealth, box office success, or critical acclaim. It is a fundamental, violent erasure of a man's dignity. The sanctuary was not just broken into, it was weaponized against him in the most degrading manner structurally possible. Furthermore, the revelation of the event exposed the terrifying silent complicity of the ecosystem that surrounded him. To successfully execute an encounter of that magnitude inside a staffed, heavily monitored building requires the absolute, terrified silence of multiple individuals. The security personnel who monitored the cameras, the concierges who cleared the VIP guests, and the inner circle of friends occupying the adjacent penthouses, they all knew. They heard the music, they saw the elevator logs, and they watched the billionaire and the supermodel navigate the hallways of the actor's home. Johnny Depp was forced to confront the agonizing reality that while he was isolated in Australia, desperately trying to keep his career and his marriage afloat, he was surrounded by a silent choir of individuals who were actively protecting the people destroying him. The people he paid, the people he housed, and the people he trusted were all violently compromised by the sheer, terrifying gravitational pull of the new Hollywood elite. The fortress had not just been invaded, the entire garrison had quietly, implicitly surrendered to the invaders. The alleged events that transpired in the master bedroom of the Eastern Columbia building transcend the standard parameters of celebrity gossip. They serve as a chilling, uncompromising autopsy of the moral decay that inherently accompanies limitless privilege. It proved that in the rarefied air of the ultra-wealthy, empathy is entirely obsolete. The age, the legacy, and the immense contributions of a cinematic icon offered absolutely zero protection against the predatory boredom of the new elite. The bed of a king was reduced to a temporary novelty, a disposable prop utilized by a young wife to secure her power, and a billionaire to prove his absolute dominance. The doors of the master suite eventually opened, the guests eventually departed, and the bed linens were quietly, meticulously changed by the household staff, but the invisible, radioactive stain of that ultimate disrespect would permanently poison the architecture of the penthouse, ensuring that the veteran actor could never truly return home. When the elevator footage finally hemorrhaged onto the internet, it triggered a ruthless global tribunal. The digital mob violently turned on Amber Heard, stripping away her carefully manufactured victim narrative and branding her the active architect of a cruel domestic coup. But the true agonizing casualty of the leak was Johnny Depp. His most private humiliation was abruptly broadcast to billions of smartphones. The veteran actor was forced to bleed out on a global stage, his pride shattered as anonymous strangers dissected the exact staggering level of his betrayal. The emasculation was total. He had funded the penthouse and powered the elevator, only to be publicly mocked in his own territory. Yet the most chilling aspect of this media firestorm was the breathtaking asymmetry of the fallout. Cara Delevingne navigated the explosive blast radius with the terrifying ease of the ultra-rich, utilizing the ultimate luxury of the aristocracy, absolute, unyielding silence. Similarly, Elon Musk demonstrated the absolute immunity of Silicon Valley capital. Despite the objective visual proof, the tech billionaire simply retreated behind his massive corporate shield. The patriarchal establishment seamlessly moved on, granting a permanent, unspoken amnesty to the elites who had actually walked into the penthouse and ignited the match. Ultimately, the Eastern Columbia penthouse scandal serves as a brutal clinical autopsy of how the modern elite trade loyalty for power. It proved that at the absolute apex of society, unimaginable wealth dissolves all traditional moral boundaries. Amber Heard discovered she was merely disposable currency, while Johnny Depp learned that even a cinematic king can be effortlessly crushed by players holding a heavier financial hand. The tragedy of the Los Angeles penthouse remains a chilling monument to the illusion of safety. In an ecosystem dominated by limitless wealth and unchecked desire, a true sanctuary simply does not exist. Every beautiful, heavily guarded fortress is ultimately just waiting to become the luxury backdrop for the next devastating betrayal.